the letter that should not exist in a sealed chamber beneath layers of stone and silence, deep within the Vatican's restricted archives. Historians once uncovered a letter that should never have survived time, a fragile sheet yellowed by centuries. Its ink faded yet unmistakably stained in places with Mark's experts, quietly described as tears mixed with blood. A document written not by a queen hardened by power, but by a frightened 14-year-old girl who had just crossed the threshold from innocence into something far darker. And that girl was Catherine de Medici, long remembered by history as ruthless, calculating, and cold, yet rarely understood as a child sent across borders like a bargaining chip in a game played by kings, popes, and dynasties hungry for influence. Born into the powerful Medici family of Florence, Catherine was raised among lessons of obedience, silence, and survival, taught that marriage was not romance, but duty. And when she was promised to Henry of Orleans, the future king of France, Europe celebrated the union as a triumph of politics and faith, while Catherine herself believed, or perhaps hoped, that the wedding night would mark the beginning of security and belonging, a moment where she would finally step into the role she had been trained for all her life. Yet the letter reveals a different truth, one whispered in broken sentences and trembling script, describing fear instead of ceremony, shadows instead of warmth, and eyes watching where there should have been privacy. As Catherine wrote of being led through stone corridors, lit by torches that flickered like warnings, her silk gloves damp with sweat, her prayers unanswered, and her instincts screaming that something ancient and wrong was unfolding beyond the songs and laughter echoing in the palace halls. The official records describe that night in Marseille on October 25, 1533, as a celebration of unity, but the letter speaks of isolation, of doors closing too slowly, of a bridal chamber prepared not for love but for a test she had never agreed to take, hinting at a hidden custom known only to the oldest nobles, a purification, whispered about but never written, designed to humble foreign brides and remind them that royal blood was guarded by cruelty as much as by crowns. Catherine's words grow darker as she recounts sensing unseen presences, hearing murmurs behind walls, realizing she was not alone, and understanding in that moment that her body was not her own, but a stage upon which power would be displayed. And as the letter reaches its end, the tone changes, fear giving way to something colder, more deliberate, as she writes not only of pain but of memory, of faces she would never forget, of voices she etched into her mind, and of a vow formed silently in the depths of humiliation, a vow that if history demanded she endure this night, then history itself would one day answer to her. And as the ink trails off, the final line suggests not a broken girl, but the first breath of a woman who had learned to survive by watching, waiting, and remembering, because what truly died that night was not her body, but her innocence, and what was born instead would one day terrify France. The forgotten purification ritual. To understand what awaited Catherine de Medici beyond the closing doors of the bridal chamber, we must step into a layer of medieval tradition that official history deliberately erased, a shadow custom passed not through books, but through whispers among France's oldest noble families, a ritual known only as the purification ceremony, believed to predate the Valois kings themselves, rooted in a fear that foreign blood could weaken royal lineage, and justified by the belief that humiliation forged obedience more effectively than loyalty ever could. Unlike public coronations or church sacraments, this rite was never recorded in ledgers, never blessed by bishops, and never acknowledged by law. Yet fragments of its existence appear centuries later in marginal notes, censored letters, and private confessions discovered in monasteries and sealed archives, all describing the same pattern. A young foreign bride, isolated on her wedding night, subjected to symbolic and physical domination, meant to strip her of identity, pride, and resistance. The ritual was not performed openly because it contradicted Christian doctrine, but within the court it was treated as necessity rather than cruelty, a way to remind queens that crowns were granted conditionally, and could be revoked just as silently. Catherine, barely 14 and raised in the structured piety of Florentine convents, had never been warned of this custom, and that omission was intentional, because fear worked best when it arrived without explanation. Those tasked with enforcing the ritual were not priests in robes, but nobles in silk and velvet, men who believed themselves guardians of tradition, positioned behind hidden slits carved into palace walls generations earlier, architectural scars designed for observation without accountability. According to later testimonies, the presence of witnesses was essential. Because purification required collective power, the weight of many eyes ensuring that the bride understood she belonged not to one husband, but to the court itself. At the center of this night stood the groom, Henry II of France, only 15, physically strong but mentally malleable, raised to obey authority without question, and already bound to the will of older figures who shaped his actions, particularly those who viewed Catherine not as a wife, but as a political instrument imported from Italy. The ritual demanded that he alternate tenderness with cruelty, confusion with command, so that the bride would never know where safety ended and submission began. A psychological fracture designed to linger long after bruises faded. Historians now believe this practice survived precisely because it left no visible scars that could be publicly questioned, while its true damage unfolded privately, reshaping the victim's inner world. Catherine's ordeal was not an isolated act of malice, but part of a broader system that treated young women as vessels of diplomacy, bodies through which alliances passed and control was enforced. And as the ritual progressed unseen, the palace above continued to celebrate with music and wine, the laughter of guests masking the reality that beneath their feet an ancient ceremony was claiming another victim. By dawn, the court would declare the marriage complete, but what they truly completed was the transformation of a frightened girl into someone who had learned, in the most brutal way possible, that survival within power required silence, memory, and patience. The bridal chamber of witnesses, as the doors of the bridal chamber closed, the silence that followed was not empty but crowded, thick with unseen presence, because hidden within the palace walls were narrow observation slits carved decades earlier, passages known only to a select circle of nobles who believed tradition granted them the right to watch. And through these openings, 23 men gathered in secrecy, their faces half lit by torchlight, their expressions ranging from curiosity to cold anticipation. Men of rank and influence who understood that what they were about to witness was forbidden to be spoken of, yet powerful to behold. Inside the chamber stood Catherine de Medici, trembling beneath layers of ceremonial silk, sensing movement beyond the walls, realizing that the unease she felt was not imagination but truth, that eyes were upon her, measuring her fear, judging her endurance, and marking her as property of the court rather than a private bride. The witnesses were not passive observers, because their presence was part of the ritual itself, reinforcing the imbalance of power by turning humiliation into spectacle. And some sipped wine slowly, while others murmured wagers under their breath, discussing how long the young Italian would endure before breaking, their cruelty soft in their own minds by the belief that tradition excused all acts committed in its name. At the center of the room was the groom Henry II of France, barely older than Catherine, but already molded by authority, instructed on how to behave, when to be gentle, and when to be harsh, his actions guided less by desire than by expectation. As unseen mentors had made clear that this night was not about intimacy but obedience, not about union but demonstration. What followed unfolded in carefully staged phases, beginning with gestures meant to deceive, moments of softness designed to lower Catherine's guard, before shifting into deliberate confusion, commands delivered without explanation, pauses stretched until fear filled the silence. And as her protests rose in her native Italian, they were swallowed by laughter echoing faintly through stone, laughter she could hear but not locate, confirming her worst realization that she was never alone. According to later medical notes uncovered in private court records, the psychological strain was so intense that Catherine's body reacted violently, blood vessels in her eyes rupturing under stress, causing tears streaked with red, a rare but documented response to extreme trauma. And when she collapsed from exhaustion or shock, the ritual did not pause, because endurance was its goal, not mercy, and a court physician was summoned discreetly to revive her, restoring consciousness only so the ceremony could continue. Each time she awoke, she saw faces leaning closer in the shadows, heard whispers discussing her strength, her weakness, her worth, and somewhere between those moments of collapse and revival, Catherine's fear began to harden, transforming into clarity, as she understood that every man watching believed himself untouchable, protected by silence and rank. They had given her something far more dangerous than submission knowledge. Tears of blood, birth of vengeance. When dawn finally crept through the narrow windows of the palace, it did not bring relief but clarity, and Catherine de Medici understood that the night had not ended so much as it had been sealed inside her locked away, where no court celebration could reach. Because while the palace servants prepared to announce the success of the marriage, Catherine lay motionless, her body exhausted, and her eyes burning, stained with the last traces of blood-tinged tears that no one would ever record in official history. The ritual had taken her strength, but it had also stripped away illusion, leaving behind a sharp awareness of how power truly worked inside the French court. And as the physician quietly examined her and confirmed she would live, Catherine realized that survival itself had become her first quiet victory. She said little in the days that followed, speaking only when required, her face carefully arranged into the calm obedience expected of a young queen. Yet behind that stillness, her mind replayed the night in precise detail, not as a victim reliving pain, but as a witness cataloging truth. Each memory filed away with unnatural clarity, because trauma, when combined with intelligence, can sharpen rather than dull the senses. She remembered the cadence of laughter behind the walls, the distinct accents of men who whispered wagers, the smell of wine on their breath even through stone, and she understood that these men believed time itself would protect them, that history would forget what they had done, because history was written by those who held the pen. But Catherine had been raised among the Medici, a family that survived centuries, not by force alone, but by patience, alliances, and an understanding that power often moved invisibly, and so she learned to do the same. Outwardly, she accepted her role as a quiet, overlooked bride, overshadowed by older figures at court, and dismissed as insignificant, which suited her perfectly, because invisibility offered safety, and safety allowed time. She began observing the court with a new purpose, watching how favors were exchanged, how rivalries formed, how fear shaped decisions more reliably than loyalty. And every lesson traced its origin back to that wedding night, when she learned that humiliation was not random but strategic. In private moments, Catherine began recording names, not as accusations but as references. Men connected to the ritual, men who spoke too freely when they believed no one listened, men whose habits revealed weaknesses, and this was not madness, as later rumors would claim, but adaptation, the natural response of someone who understood that justice would never be offered willingly, and therefore would have to be constructed. The court mistook her silence for submission, her youth for fragility, and her restraint for forgetfulness. And this miscalculation became their greatest error, because while they celebrated her compliance, Catherine was building endurance, learning restraint, and waiting for the moment when power would shift enough for memory to act. The girl who had entered the bridal chamber had been shaped by duty and faith, but the woman who emerged was shaped by knowledge, and she understood now that in a world governed by hidden rituals and unspoken cruelty, survival required more than obedience. It required control. The death's history couldn't explain years past, and the French court changed faces but not habits. And within that slow passage of time, Catherine de Medici transformed from an overlooked young bride into a figure of quiet authority, trusted enough to be present, yet underestimated enough to be ignored, a balance that allowed her to move through corridors of power without drawing suspicion. And it was during this period that the first unexplained death occurred, a nobleman found lifeless after a private supper, his passing attributed officially to illness, though whispers spread of discoloration on his lips and a stiffness that arrived too quickly to be natural. The court accepted the explanation because it was convenient, because questioning it would have required examining traditions no one wanted exposed. And soon another man fell, then another, each death isolated in records, each treated as coincidence, yet all sharing subtle similarities that only someone watching carefully could connect. Servants spoke of sudden fevers, physicians argued over causes, and priests hurried through final rites. But beneath the surface, a pattern began to form, one that historians centuries later would struggle to piece together from fragmented notes and censored letters, because these men were not random victims, but individuals bound by a single secret, one forged on a wedding night long past. Catherine never appeared near the scenes, never raised her voice, never acted in ways that invited scrutiny, and this restraint was essential, because revenge, when rushed, reveals itself, while patience allows others to dismiss what they cannot easily explain. Poisons of the era were subtle tools, derived from plants, minerals, and compounds that could mimic natural causes. Knowledge carefully preserved in private manuscripts and passed quietly among those who understood. That power was safest when invisible, and Catherine had access to such knowledge, not because she sought darkness, but because survival at court demanded familiarity with it. Nobles continued to drink wine, confident in their rank, unaware that the very rituals they once used to dominate had taught their victim how secrecy worked, how silence protected action, and how memory outlasted fear. As the list of deaths grew, so did unease, though it remained unspoken, because the idea that a queen could act deliberately, patiently, and without witnesses was more terrifying than any accusation. And so the court chose denial, labeling rumors as superstition and insisting that fate, not design, was to blame. Catherine's strength lay not in cruelty, but in precision, because she never struck without certainty, never acted without timing, and never allowed emotion to replace calculation, understanding that vengeance fueled by rage burns quickly, while vengeance guided by memory endures. Historians now believe that some deaths were warnings rather than punishments, reminders to those who remained that silence was still required, that the past was not as buried as they believed, and that survival sometimes depended on forgetting what one had once proudly witnessed. By the time suspicion began to stir, it had nowhere to land, because Catherine had ensured that every act appeared disconnected, every consequence delayed, and every link obscured by time. And in doing so, she demonstrated a truth the court had taught her years earlier. That power is most effective when it leaves no visible trace. When trauma becomes a weapon by the time the final reckoning arrived, Catherine de Medici no longer resembled the frightened bride history preferred to forget, because decades of court life had refined her patience into something formidable. And when the last influential figure connected to that wedding night began to falter, it was not through spectacle, but through inevitability. A slow unraveling driven by fear, isolation, and the realization that secrets rot from the inside. This man, protected by rank and reputation, had long believed himself immune, yet immunity is fragile when built on silence. And as alliances shifted and loyalties thinned, Catherine understood that the greatest punishment was not death itself, but exposure to one's own vulnerability, the same vulnerability she had once been forced to endure. Historians argue over whether his end was natural, engineered, or merely accelerated by subtle pressure. But what matters is that after his fall the pattern ceased, the quiet death stopped, and the court returned to a familiar calm, a calm that mistook absence for innocence. Catherine never confessed, never left a written admission that could bind her to these acts. because she understood that history favors ambiguity, and ambiguity protects those who master it. Yet fragments remain, scattered across marginal notes, intercepted correspondence, and the uneasy consistency of timing, enough to suggest intention without ever proving it. In later years, chroniclers painted her as monstrous, attributing every unexplained tragedy to her hand, because it was easier to blame a woman than to confront the system that created her. And in doing so, they transformed a survivor into a symbol, stripping away context until only fear remained. What these accounts ignore is that Catherine did not invent cruelty at the French court. She inherited it, learned its language, and turned it inward, reflecting back the same logic that once justified her humiliation, the logic that power could act without consequence as long as it remained unseen. In her final years, surrounded by portraits and tapestries depicting saints and victories, Catherine reportedly spent long hours in silence, not haunted by guilt, but by understanding, because memory does not fade simply because time passes, and survival does not erase the cost of endurance. The wedding night that history recorded as a political success had, in truth, produced a queen who governed through restraint rather than mercy, calculation rather than impulse. And while some would call this evil, others would recognize it as adaptation within a world that rewarded cruelty and punished vulnerability. Catherine's story forces an uncomfortable reflection that when institutions normalize hidden violence, they should not be surprised when those who endure it learn to wield secrecy as a weapon, and that the line between victim and villain is often drawn not by actions alone, but by who is allowed to tell the story. In the end, Catherine did not destroy the system that broke her. She survived within it, reshaped by it, and left behind a legacy that still unsettles historians, because it suggests that beneath the polished surface of power, humanity's darkest rituals rarely disappear. They simply wait for someone patient enough to remember them. Final reflection. History prefers simple villains, but Catherine's life reminds us that when cruelty is ritualized, survival itself can become an act the world later calls monstrous.